in terms of society, you had your nuclear family. You had the husband who would go to work, you would have the wife who would stay at home with the kids, and this had a profound impact psychologically on the children at home. But this happened for about 100 years before the 1970s. And there's many reasons for this. If you remember, after World War II, the European economy was completely destroyed. And this was, just in terms of time period, the United States had this very strong, strong economy where they could export goods, right, manufactured goods to Europe. And Europe wasn't able to do it themselves for a very long time. So we had a situation here in the United States where you had employers, you had companies and employers, and they were not able to find enough workers because there was an immense amount of demand for their goods, and they weren't able to find enough workers. And so 100 years before the 1970s, you find that the wages were increasing real wages. And you can probably see that on the graph here. I don't know if the pointer's working, but give it a shot. You can see that here, rising real wages. And you see you come to the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, things started to change. Something happened here. And what we find is that the real wages, and let me just define real wages before we move on. Real wages are your wages compared to the purchasing power, right? So if your wages are going up, but the price of items are going up, your spending power is the same. And that's what we mean by real wages. Okay, everyone clear about that? What we mean by real wages? Okay. So real wages were increasing 100 years before the 1970s. And then you'll notice that in the 1970s, all of a sudden, it flatlines. It goes flat. Real wages stopped rising. And so in 1978, the real wages that were present in 1978 are exactly the same today. They have not changed. There's been no increase in real wages. Now, real wages, not wages in general. I know people are thinking, well, I used to get this paycheck and now I'm getting a higher paycheck. That's not what I'm talking about. Real wages. It hasn't increased. From 1978, there's been no increase. Now, in terms of what happened, there's three basic factors where we can say as to why the real wages flatlined. Number one, you had immigration. And for many of us who are coming from either the Middle East or from India, Pakistan, and that area of the world, this was a time when in 1965 they had lifted a certain law in the United States banning people from the Middle East and South Asia coming in or migrating to the United States. In 1965, that law was lifted. So many of our parents or grandparents came in those days. Why? Because they saw that this rising wage in the United States, well, we should go now and cash in on that, right? As did other people from all over the world. So you have this wave of immigration coming in. And now as an employer, before you had a shortage of workers. Now you have an increase. It doesn't make sense. You don't have to go to business school to understand that if the labor is higher, you have more people that want to work, and and you have and your demand is high, you don't have to increase their wages. It's common sense, right? Okay, so one factor was immigration. The second factor had to do with a women's liberation movement, where you find in the 1970s, there was a very strong women's liberation movement where women had come out and they said, we want to join the workforce. And there's many implications of that. I don't want to get into details. But aside from just immigration, now you had women, a whole 50% of society adding to the workforce. So now you have even more workers. But there was a third factor that we can attribute to this flatlining of real wages. And that was technology. In the 1970s, this is where when you start reading the biography of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, etc., you find that this is when technology took off. And because of technology, you didn't need the amount of labor that you would need before. And because that's the case now, you're not going to increase paying your workers. One more factor, and that factor was that, what we had seen was that 100 years before, you found Europe in shambles, and we had a very strong demand. But now, once Europe had come back, Germany now has a robust economy, Japan has a robust economy, now they're competing. And so now in the United States, we have to refigure our business process, how we're going to compete. And so we started to move operations abroad. And so this leads to even less demand for workers. So in 1970s, we could say that this was a watershed moment. This is where the wages flatlined. Okay. Now, what happened to the American worker at this point? For 100 years, the American worker was enjoying rising wages. So do we now just say, as American, do we just, as an American worker, would you just say, okay, you know what? We're now going to stop. We're going to stop spending money the way we did. We're not going to, spend money, because in those days, they would, you would buy a car outright. You could have all the luxuries you wanted, so on and so forth. So can you imagine a society now just saying, okay, we don't have enough money? No. There was a reaction. What was the reaction? Well, as a worker, you think that, okay, if the wages per hour are not going up, but I still need more money to sustain my standard of living, I know we'll work more hours. And so you find that the American male has now gone out to work and is working more hours to make up what they had in terms of a rising standard of living. So now they're working more hours. And it's come to the point today that the United States has zoomed to the top position. Top position of what? Top position of the number of paid hours that the American worker works. We work more paid hours than any other country on the planet. We are beyond busy. Okay? That was one issue that arose. You had, and of course, women in the house were already out because of the women's liberation movement, so they were working. The children started to go to work as well. We wanted to maintain that standard of living, and older people started to come out of retirement, okay, to keep up that standard of living. But there was something else that happened, which was unfortunate, but happened. And that was, when you think about how exactly to make more money, there's certain ways you can do it. Either you work more, and when you can't work anymore, when you're exhausted, you can go out and borrow the money. So in the United States, we went on a borrowing binge. I mean, astronomical amounts. People were borrowing left and right. And you had financial devices that started to be introduced that weren't present before. The debt-to-income ratio in the household in 1952, debt-to-income ratio in the household was 40%. The debt-to-income ratio in 2009, 137%. There's more debt and income, and it's been rising. So the other reaction that we had here in the United States was that we started to get into debt more and more and more. And the breaking point happens in 2007 when this economic recession started. Because on a flat wage, there's only so much you can borrow because you can't pay it back. Your wages are flat. So at a certain point, there's a breaking point. You can't pay it back. And so the economy busts. Okay, and 2007 was that point. 10 minutes? Oh, man, so much left. Okay. All right. So if this situation has made you a little down or depressed, feeling bad, I want to make you a little more happy. Let me tell you about what happened with the employer, because that will cheer you up. Okay. What happened with the employer? In the last 30 years, it was spectacular. They made money like it was going out of style. It was amazing. And we have to ask, why? Well, you see, in the last 30 years, if you look at this graph here, we have the second line on top that's going way up. And this line here, this is productivity. In other words, productivity for the employer was going up. You had workers that were working more hours and working harder. You had technology now, so the production process is getting more and more efficient. And so now you have a flat wage here, and you have productivity going up. So let's get this straight now. What the employer is now making, right, in terms of productivity, what we are contributing to the employer in terms of productivity is rising. What the employer is giving to the worker is now flat. The difference between the two, brothers and sisters, here is pure profit. So the last 30 years have been phenomenal. I mean, they were, as they say, rolling in the dough. Now, when you think about it, they had to now give some sort of theories. Why exactly were they making all of this money, right? So they started to come up with various things. So you find in this day, in this day and age, when the profits start to increase, they said that, look, here's our explanation. Why is it that we're making these phenomenal profits? The reason is because the managers of these companies were entrepreneurial geniuses. That's why we made all this money. Okay, they have a technical term in economics that explains this. This is bogus. Okay? The reason why the profits were going up is as we have seen. Productivity was going up, wages have flatlined. Okay, so now they're rolling in the dough. They're making this tremendous amount of money. We have to now understand, what did they do with all this money? Or what are some of the implications? Number one, and I'm going to kind of speed it through. Number one, the first thing they did is they said, look, we need someone to manage this money, right? Because we're on another planet. We have so much money, we're not even like the regular people that are existing on this world. So what are we going to do with this money? We need specific people to manage our money. And so comes along hedge funds, right? And you have these specialists that are now managing money. And I'm skipping some details here because of time, because I want to get to our recession as it is today in terms of this bubble. But now you have these hedge funds, and just like the people that are investing with these hedge funds, the hedge funds want to now make more and more money. How do they do this? Well, one way is you can go conventional and just sell stock. Okay, that's one way of doing it. But the real money maker was in the American working class. What do I mean? The American working class is now taking debts like crazy. Credit card debts, student loans, houses, so on and so forth. So what they started to do is they started taking these debts, packaging them up into securities, and selling it to people. And so when Mr. Jones or Mr. Smith, in wherever in New York is paying on his house the $1,500 for his mortgage, when you have this security, you get $52 out of that interest payment that he's making or he or she is making. So these securities, they started packaging these debts. Now these debts, if you think about it, they were being given out very loosely. You could get a credit card in a snap. You could get a home loan very easily. Your credit really didn't matter if you remember this time period. And these very debts were being prepackaged and sold to people across the world. Now, well, people in the United States first and foremost. But what they thought now, they said, look, this is wonderful. We're not only making this money, and we're now making money off of the money that we're lending out to the American worker, but now we need to make even more money. So we want to take this global. So they started to market these, what they call asset-backed securities, to the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world, you're sitting in Malaysia or Dubai or whatever it is, and they said, that's fine, but it's a debt. So we don't really trust. What if they don't pay their debt? And then they said, no problem. What we'll do is we're going to go and we're going to get a rating. Right? So they started having rating companies, Moody's, Standards & Poor's, and so on and so forth. And the best rating, AAA. So they started having these companies that if you go to them and you want to get a rating, you say, look, I want to get a rating, and I'd like you to give me a rating. And the companies, they know that, these rating companies, they know that if you don't give the person a good rating, they will just take their money and go somewhere else to get a good rating. So the very companies that are being paid for the ratings are giving the ratings. So obviously the ratings are going to be good. AAA, that was the best rating. So these asset-backed securities, right, which had nothing really backing them, just the debt, were now giving AAA ratings. Wonderful. But you see, the international community, again, they weren't that stupid. They said, we know how these things work, these ratings. We understand how these ratings work. So they said, okay, no problem. What we're going to do now, we're going to insure the securities. Literally, they're going to take an insurance policy, put on the security, and staple it. So now, no problem. If they don't pay their debts, we've insured you. No problem. But see, there was a slight problem. See, here in the United States, when we typically think of insurers, it's not a very good impression, even amongst non-Muslims, especially amongst non-Muslims. When they think of insurers, we know them as thieves. So in each one of the 50 states, you have an insurance commission that's set up, where if an insurance company wants to come, they have to now show their books, and they have to show how many assets they have, and so on and so forth. So when these companies, and by the way, the biggest company amongst them was AIG, the American Insurance Group. So when these companies went, they said, we don't want to have to go in front of the commission and show them, what we have, and it's going to be complicated. So what we're going to do is we're going to now change the name. So they weren't called insurance policies now. They were called credit default swaps. So if you've ever heard this term, credit default swap, it's an insurance policy. And so companies like AIG, they started writing them in the millions and the billions with nothing to back it up.